The Christmas Truce of 1914, a pause in the darkness. In the midst of the relentless turmoil of World War I, December 1914 brought a remarkable and unexpected moment of humanity on the battlefields of Europe. Soldiers entrenched in the mud and misery of the Western Front paused, if only for a brief moment, to celebrate a familiar tradition. Christmas, known as the Christmas Truce. This extraordinary event stands as a poignant reminder of the resilience of human spirit and the enduring hope for peace, even amidst the most harrowing circumstances. For a short time, enemies became neighbors, exchanging gestures of goodwill, gifts, and even songs, as the world outside the trenches seemed to vanish. The truce, spontaneous and unofficial, was never repeated on such a scale, yet it remains one of the most remarkable episodes of World War I, illustrating how the common humanity of soldiers could rise above the divisions of war. Amid the desolation of barbed wire, shell craters, and the pervasive cold, soldiers from both sides found themselves drawn to the familiar symbols of Christmas: evergreens, songs, and the distant memories of home. Letters written later described men cautiously emerging from their trenches, calling across the no-man's land to their enemies with greetings, and even risking personal safety to shake hands, share small gifts, or bury the dead. The truce reflected a complex mixture of fear, exhaustion, and longing, but also a profound acknowledgement that in some moments, the shared humanity of individuals could transcend political and military allegiances. In this script, we will explore the Christmas Truce in detail, beginning with its origins, the daily conditions that made such an event both improbable and miraculous, and the personal stories of soldiers who experienced this fleeting peace. Each section will reveal unique aspects of the truce, from spontaneous football matches to the symbolic gestures of goodwill that endured far beyond the battlefield. Through these stories, we can glimpse a world where compassion and hope briefly overcame conflict, weaving a legacy that continues to inspire today. 1. The Trenches Before Christmas. By December 1914, World War I had settled into a grim stalemate. The Western Front, stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border, was a landscape of trenches, mud, and misery. Soldiers from Britain, France, and Germany lived and fought in narrow waterlogged ditches, often no more than a few hundred meters from the enemy. Conditions were harsh. Winter had begun to freeze the mud, rations were meager, and disease was rampant. Frostbite, trench foot, and respiratory illnesses were constant threats. Yet amid this suffering, Christmas approached, carrying with it the memories of family, warmth, and traditions left far behind. The soldiers, young men in their late teens and 20s, had been drafted or volunteered from villages and towns, many with little exposure to the horrors of modern mechanized warfare. Letters and diaries reveal a sense of alienation and longing, as the sound of gunfire and the rhythm of artillery replaced the familiar patterns of civilian life. Still, even in this bleak environment, traditions persisted. Some soldiers carved small decorations from scrap wood or used pine boughs to adorn their posts. Others sang carols quietly to themselves, recalling the comfort of home. The proximity of the opposing sides made interaction possible, despite official prohibitions. Trench lines were sometimes separated by as little as 50 meters, and no man's land, though dangerous, became a potential meeting space. Soldiers observed each other across the lines, noticing mundane details. Who was eating what? Which men appeared exhausted, and even subtle signs of illness or injury. In these observations, a sense of common humanity began to emerge. Letters from German and British soldiers alike describe how men would occasionally call across the line, joking or singing, testing the boundaries of hostility in small, tentative ways. The idea of a truce was almost unimaginable. Military discipline strictly forbade fraternization, and commanding officers feared any show of empathy with the enemy. Yet in practice, the grinding monotony and the human need for connection created cracks in the rigid structure. Soldiers would light candles on Christmas Eve, set up small evergreen trees, and attempt to replicate familiar rituals. These acts of remembrance, though simple, reminded men of life outside the war and set the stage for what would become a historic pause in combat. In some sectors, prior to the official start of the truce, individual soldiers took small, courageous steps. They ventured into no man's land to retrieve personal belongings or even to bury fallen comrades from both sides. These gestures were acts of shared morality, signaling that the men were not simply instruments of war, but human beings bound by conscience. As the day of December 24th approached, the air of anticipation mingled with fear. Would the enemy fire, or would a gesture of goodwill be met in kind? The tension was palpable, yet the longing for connection outweighed caution in some places. The stage was set not by generals or governments, but by the soldiers themselves, who relied on memory, instinct, and shared rituals to guide their actions. Christmas was a rare beacon of humanity in a landscape dominated by death and destruction. It reminded men that even in the worst circumstances, they carried within them the capacity for empathy, imagination, and moral judgment. In this, the first seeds of the Christmas truce were sown, not as an official policy, but as a spontaneous, profoundly human response to the absurdity of war. 2. The first steps across no man's land. As December 24, 1914 arrived, the Western Front was shrouded in a biting winter chill. Frost covered the mud and frozen trenches, and the distant roar of artillery was a constant reminder of the world outside the momentary peace about to unfold. Soldiers on both sides, exhausted by months of fighting and haunted by the ever-present shadow of death, sensed that this Christmas might bring more than cold and despair. Across the trenches, tentative gestures began to appear, small signals, tentative calls, and the occasional hesitant whistle. On the German side, some soldiers hung candles on their trench parapets or placed small evergreens in makeshift holders. They sang Stille Nacht, the German carol that would later be translated into countless languages, its melody floating across the frozen expanse to reach British ears. On the British side, men listened, recognizing the familiar tune from home, and cautiously responded with their own carols, including Silent Night and God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen. The music was the first thread that connected these divided men, a shared language of hope and memory that transcended uniforms and nationalities. The first brave steps across no man's land were small and tentative. Soldiers ventured forward with empty hands, arms raised to show that they carried no weapons, moving slowly and carefully over the frozen, cratered earth. In some sectors, a German soldier would call, "Merry Christmas," to the British lines. A British voice would respond in kind. Words were exchanged awkwardly at first. Simple greetings, questions about the well-being of comrades, and cautious assurances that the men meant no harm. This dialogue, often whispered or shouted over short distances, carried the weight of months of suffering and fear, a fragile thread of human connection stretched across the deadliest of landscapes. These initial contacts led to remarkable acts of bravery. Men helped each other retrieve the bodies of fallen soldiers, regardless of which side they belonged to. Graves were marked, and in some cases, makeshift wooden crosses were erected in the snow as silent memorials. Letters and diaries later recounted how soldiers dug shallow graves or simply placed the dead carefully in no man's land to avoid further desecration. Such actions reflected a deep understanding of shared mortality, an acknowledgement that war was not the sum total of human existence, and that even enemies could share in the rituals of respect and remembrance. As the day progressed, exchanges became bolder. Soldiers began sharing small gifts, cigarettes, chocolate, biscuits, and even alcohol. German and British troops alike marveled at the ingenuity and courage of those who crossed over to offer these items. Simple gestures, lighting a fire, offering a hand to shake, sharing a laugh, took on enormous significance. Letters from the time describe British soldiers carefully examining the gifts, aware that the mere act of giving was a symbolic bridge over the horrors that had divided them for months. In one well-documented instance, a German soldier gave a British officer a tin of preserves, and in return received a parcel of tobacco. These acts, though small, were revolutionary in the context of war, a tangible assertion of humanity. Perhaps the most iconic aspect of the Christmas truce was the spontaneous football matches. In several sectors, men set aside their weapons and used a makeshift ball to play impromptu games on the snow-covered battlefield. These matches, described as both competitive and jovial, transformed the lethal landscape into a field of shared amusement. British soldiers wrote in their letters that for a few precious hours, the constant anxiety and danger melted away. German soldiers, too, noted the surreal nature of playing a game with their sworn enemies, laughing and cheering as if no war existed. Football, simple and universal, became the medium through which these men reclaimed their humanity. Amid the laughter and exchange of gifts, there were also moments of quiet reflection. Soldiers on both sides took the opportunity to sing and listen, to share personal stories, and to exchange photographs of loved ones. The truce was not merely a pause in fighting. It was a moment of social and emotional reconstruction, a rare space where men could reconnect with the parts of themselves that the war had threatened to erase. This fleeting fraternity was filled with empathy, respect, and a shared sense of wonder at the world beyond the trenches. Yet the truce was fragile and highly localized. Not every sector participated. In some places, commanders actively forbade fraternization and fired warning shots to keep men in line. Even where the truce occurred, soldiers knew it could not last. The sound of artillery in the distance, the expectation of renewed orders, and the realization of military discipline hung over them like a dark cloud. Still, for several hours, the front lines became a place of exchange, laughter, and tentative trust. The courage to step into no man's land, even for a moment, embodied the profound human desire for connection, memory, and meaning amidst chaos. By nightfall on Christmas Day, soldiers gradually returned to their trenches, carrying with them the memory of a day that transcended the violence surrounding them. The truce did not end the war, nor did it alter strategic outcomes, but it left a lasting impression on those who experienced it. Letters, diaries, and memoirs provide vivid accounts of the day, capturing both the surreal nature of the event and the enduring impact it had on the men's lives. In these writings, one finds a recurring theme, that even in the darkest moments, the human spirit seeks light, connection, and understanding. The Christmas Truce of 1914 remains one of the most extraordinary episodes of World War I, illustrating the capacity for empathy and shared humanity, even in the midst of unimaginable suffering. It is a story of bravery, creativity, and hope, where men defied not only the enemy, but the very machinery of war itself. For a brief and shining moment, the trenches were transformed from instruments of death into spaces of fellowship, proving that even in conflict, the desire for peace is universal, timeless, and profoundly moving. 3. Echoes beyond the trenches, personal stories and lasting memories. The Christmas Truce of 1914 did not merely exist in the fleeting hours of snow and song. Its resonance continued long after soldiers returned to the relentless grind of war. While military strategists may have dismissed it as a momentary lapse in discipline, for the men who experienced it, the truce became a profound memory, a psychological lifeline, and a rare affirmation of humanity in the midst of relentless violence. Letters, diaries, and memoirs reveal that the events of that day left indelible marks on the men, shaping how they thought of their enemies, their comrades, and even themselves. Private Thomas Hughes of the British Army described walking across no man's land and encountering a German soldier who offered him a bar of chocolate. Hughes wrote that the gesture felt like a whisper from a world I thought I had left behind, one where kindness was not a weapon, but a choice. Such small acts of generosity and empathy were magnified by the context. Weeks of mud, gunfire, and the ever-present threat of death made each human connection feel monumental. Many soldiers reported that they had never before or since experienced such an intense confrontation with the shared humanity of their enemies. The truce humanized the enemy in a way that no propaganda or order of battle could undo. For the German soldiers, too, the memories were equally vivid. Corporal Hans Weber, stationed near Ypres, recounted that he and several British soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, singing carols until the snow began to fall again. For those few hours, we were simply men, not soldiers, not enemies. reflections highlight the paradoxical nature of the truce. In the midst of industrialized death, humanity blossomed in quiet, almost forbidden ways. Acts of singing, laughter, and the sharing of food became forms of resistance to the war itself, a declaration that life and empathy were more powerful than the machinery of violence. The personal impact of the truce extended far beyond the emotional. For some soldiers, it challenged the narratives they had been taught about the enemy. Many went into the war believing in the absolute evil of their opponents, only to discover that men on the other side sang familiar songs, worried about their families, and felt the same fears and hopes. Letters written after the truce reveal a recurring theme. Soldiers struggled to reconcile the memory of shared camaraderie with the ongoing horrors they were forced to endure. The truce created a cognitive dissonance, a tension between the ideology of war and the reality of human connection. Photographs and drawings made during the event also contributed to its enduring memory. While photography on the front lines was limited, several soldiers captured scenes of men shaking hands, exchanging gifts, or playing football in the snow. These images, smuggled home in letters or preserved in wartime archives, became iconic symbols of peace and empathy amid chaos. For future generations, they provided tangible proof that even in the worst conditions, human beings could assert kindness and imagination against overwhelming odds. The visuals carried a lesson that words alone could not convey, that shared humanity could transcend national boundaries and military orders. Families back home were often deeply moved when they received letters recounting the truce. Mothers, wives, and sisters read about their loved ones laughing with the enemy and sharing cigarettes or chocolate, and many described mixed feelings of pride, relief, and disbelief. For these civilians, the truce offered a rare glimpse of hope amid the otherwise grim news of the war. It reinforced the idea that the soldiers in the trenches were more than just cogs in a military machine. They were human beings capable of empathy, courage, and spontaneity, even under the most extreme conditions. The psychological impact on the soldiers themselves was also profound. Many described feeling a renewed sense of life and identity. In the midst of trench warfare, where men were reduced to survival and obedience, the truce offered a space for emotional expression, for laughter, and even for spiritual reflection. Some soldiers noted that they felt guilt for enjoying moments of connection and joy while the war continued. Yet, over time, these memories became cherished pockets of solace, reminders that the human spirit could endure even in the bleakest of circumstances. Cultural memory of the Christmas truce grew over the years, cementing its place as one of the most extraordinary events of World War I. Stories of the truce appeared in newspapers, memoirs, and later in literature, music, and films. Its symbolic power resonated beyond the war itself. It became a story of reconciliation, of hope, and of the possibility that humanity could prevail even amidst the darkest circumstances. The event has been referenced in countless cultural works, each emphasizing different facets: the courage it took to cross no man's land, the beauty of spontaneous human connection, and the ephemeral nature of peace in a world torn by conflict. However, it is important to note that the truce was not universally experienced or accepted. In many areas of the front, commanding officers forbade fraternization, and in some cases, acts of crossing no man's land were punished. Moreover, the truce was temporary. The very next day, artillery resumed, orders were given, and the grim machinery of war returned in full force. Yet even within these limitations, the truce left a lasting impression, a reminder that acts of compassion and bravery can exist even when surrounded by destruction. Historians have debated why the truce occurred and what factors contributed to its spontaneous emergence. Some argue that exhaustion, the influence of Christmas traditions, and localized morale played crucial roles. Others highlight the shared cultural backgrounds and the emotional resonance of carols and familiar rituals. Regardless of the explanation, the truce demonstrated a profound truth, that even in the most hostile environments, human beings retain the capacity for empathy, creativity, and understanding. Ultimately, the Christmas Truce of 1914 reminds us that history is not only shaped by armies and politics, but also by the everyday choices of individuals. In stepping across no man's land, singing, laughing, and sharing with their so-called enemies, the soldiers challenged the inevitability of war. They asserted, if only for a fleeting moment, that peace, joy, and humanity could prevail, even where destruction reigned. The truce was not merely an anomaly. It was a testament to the enduring power of compassion and connection in the human heart. 4. Commanders, consequences, and the limits of fraternization. While the Christmas Truce of 1914 is remembered primarily through the personal stories of soldiers and their fleeting acts of camaraderie, it also created significant dilemmas for military command. From the trenches to the headquarters in London, Berlin, and Paris, generals and officers were forced to grapple with the implications of this spontaneous pause in fighting. For them, the truce was both a disruption of strategy and a challenge to authority, highlighting the tension between human empathy and the rigid demands of war. Understanding the perspectives of commanding officers provides a fuller picture of the truce and its consequences, and it illuminates how rare and extraordinary such an event truly was. On the British side, officers were initially bewildered by reports of soldiers crossing into no man's land, while many soldiers recounted sharing gifts, singing carols, and playing football with enemy troops. Some higher-ranking officials were concerned that these fraternizations could weaken discipline and erode morale in the long term. Brigadier General Hubert Gough, commanding part of the British forces on the Western Front, expressed frustration in his correspondence, remarking that the men appear to have forgotten the purpose of their arms, and some may need reminders that the enemy is not a friend to be entertained. His words reveal the tension between witnessing a human moment of empathy and maintaining the strict control required for military operations. German commanders, too, faced similar challenges. Some were angered that soldiers were participating in fraternization, fearing it would compromise defensive positions or make their troops more vulnerable to surprise attacks. Yet, in many cases, the officers were unable or unwilling to enforce strict punitive measures. Communication across front lines was difficult, and by the time reports arrived, the truce had already concluded. In letters home, some German officers expressed a grudging admiration for the soldiers' courage and the humanity they displayed, noting that even in a disciplined army, the shared experience of danger and cold could provoke extraordinary empathy. The military consequences of the truce were, fortunately, limited. The fighting resumed within days, and the broader trajectory of World War I continued its devastating march. However, the event did influence the way commanders considered morale and the behavior of troops. Some recognized that their soldiers were not mere instruments of war. They were human beings with emotional needs, capable of forming connections even with enemies. The truce served as a reminder that morale could be a complex factor in strategy, and that forcing rigid obedience without consideration of the men's humanity could have unintended consequences. Interestingly, some officers saw the truce not merely as a lapse in discipline, but as an opportunity for reflection. Several commanders permitted brief truces in subsequent years for practical reasons, such as burying the dead or repairing trenches. While these events were far more controlled and limited than the spontaneous 1914 truce, they reflected an acknowledgement that small gestures of humanity could coexist with military objectives. In this sense, the Christmas Truce became a touchstone for understanding the limits and possibilities of human behavior, even in highly regimented structures. The psychological dimension of the truce also posed challenges for commanders. Soldiers who had experienced the camaraderie with the enemy were sometimes reluctant to re-engage in violence. Reports from various units suggest that some men hesitated when ordered to open fire, haunted by the memory of shared laughter and song from the previous day. While these moments of hesitation were not widespread, they underscored a profound truth. Soldiers' experiences on the front lines were shaped not only by orders, but also by the human interactions that occurred in between. Commanders had to balance the need for discipline with an understanding of the moral and emotional complexity of their troops. From a broader strategic perspective, the truce highlighted the unpredictable nature of war when human behavior is involved. Military plans are typically designed under the assumption of obedience and predictability. But events like the Christmas Truce introduce variables that cannot be accounted for on maps or in calculations. The officers' inability to fully control their men underscored the limits of military authority and revealed how shared humanity could, for brief moments, disrupt the machinery of conflict. This unpredictability, while minor in the scope of the war, illustrated that even in the deadliest conditions, human agency could assert itself in meaningful ways. The truce also sparked debate among historians and military theorists. Some have argued that it demonstrated the importance of empathy in maintaining long-term discipline and morale, while others view it as a cautionary tale about the risks of leniency in hierarchical structures. In either case, The Christmas Truce challenges conventional notions of war, emphasizing that the lives, choices, and emotions of individual soldiers play a role as significant as any plan or strategy. The truce forced military leadership to recognize that obedience alone cannot account for the ethical and emotional dimensions of human life under extreme conditions. Beyond the immediate military consequences, the truce had lasting cultural implications. News of the event spread through newspapers and letters, reaching civilians who marveled at the temporary suspension of hostilities. For some, the story inspired hope that reconciliation was possible even in a world riven by conflict. For others, it raised questions about the morality of war and the nature of enemy combatants. In this sense, the truce transcended the trenches, becoming both a historical event and a moral parable about the possibilities of human connection amidst destruction. The dual perspectives of soldiers and commanders illuminate the extraordinary nature of the Christmas truce. While soldiers crossed boundaries in search of shared humanity, commanders struggled to reconcile these acts with military necessity. This tension between obedience and empathy, order and spontaneity, underscores the uniqueness of the event. It was not merely a pause in violence, but a profound human statement about compassion and moral courage. Even amid one of the deadliest wars in history, the truce demonstrates that moments of choice, however fleeting, can have enduring significance. Ultimately, the story of commanders and soldiers during the Christmas Truce of 1914 serves as a reminder that history is shaped as much by the choices of individuals as by strategies, orders, or national objectives. The truce was an anomaly, yet it remains a powerful symbol of the capacity for empathy, courage, and moral reflection, even in the darkest circumstances. By examining the perspectives of those in authority, alongside the soldiers who defied conventional expectations, we gain a richer understanding of how extraordinary moments of humanity can emerge even amid the machinery of war. 5 ripples beyond the trenches, civilians and the emotional echo of the truce. While the Christmas Truce of 1914 is often remembered for its vivid scenes in the mud-filled trenches of Flanders, its effects extended far beyond the front lines. Families waiting anxiously at home, communities fearful for their loved ones, and civilians in occupied territories all felt the emotional reverberations of those brief hours when guns fell silent. Letters, newspapers, and memoirs from the period reveal that the truce was more than a temporary cessation of violence. It became a symbol of hope, a momentary bridge between distant worlds, and a profound reflection on the human capacity for empathy in the midst of chaos. Understanding the impact on civilians provides a fuller perspective of the truce, illustrating how one moment of compassion in the trenches could ripple outward to touch countless lives far removed from the battlefield. For families in Britain, Germany, and France, Christmas 1914 was initially shrouded in anxiety and dread. The war, barely 5 months old, had already claimed tens of thousands of lives, and news from the front was a mixture of sporadic victories and devastating losses. Parents, siblings, and children wrote letters filled with concern, hoping that their loved ones would survive the frigid winter, the mud, and the constant barrage of artillery. In this environment of fear, reports of soldiers shaking hands with the enemy, exchanging gifts, or singing together seemed almost unbelievable. Newspapers in London reported cautiously on the event, emphasizing its extraordinary nature and framing it as a reminder of soldiers' humanity rather than a threat to military discipline. Letters from the front provide a more intimate glimpse of how civilians perceived the truce. Soldiers wrote to their families describing the surreal scene, enemies sharing cigarettes, tossing footballs, and decorating trenches with makeshift Christmas trees. One British private wrote home, "I cannot believe it myself, but today we laughed with those we are meant to hate. I hope you understand that in the mud and cold, we are still human, and we crave warmth and joy as much as you do." Families reading such accounts were often moved to tears, not only by the relief that their loved ones survived the day, but also by the profound sense of shared humanity conveyed through words on a page. Civilians in occupied territories had a different perspective, but were similarly affected by news of the truce. In Belgium and northern France, where towns and villages were caught between opposing armies, locals closely observed the behavior of soldiers on both sides. Residents reported that the temporary cessation of hostilities allowed them to tend to essential tasks, repair damage, and, in some cases, celebrate the holiday with a cautious sense of normalcy. In small towns, people recalled soldiers weaving small gifts or exchanging pleasantries with residents, which created brief moments of relief in an otherwise oppressive landscape. For civilians, the truce was not only an unusual interruption in fighting, but also a humanizing window into the lives of men who had previously been faceless threats. The emotional impact on children is particularly notable. Families often shielded children from the horrors of war, but even limited knowledge of the truce seemed to stir wonder and hope. Children imagined soldiers on both sides, covered in mud and frost, shaking hands and singing carols, and, for a few hours, the abstract concept of war became more tangible, yet less terrifying. Stories of shared games and laughter between enemies made the idea of reconciliation imaginable, planting seeds of empathy in young minds that would carry forward long after the guns resumed their deadly chorus. In a time when propaganda often dehumanized the enemy, the truce provided a striking counter-narrative that even in war, people could act with decency, kindness, and courage. Letters from mothers, fathers, and siblings reveal the tension between joy and anxiety that the truce provoked. Some parents feared that reading about fraternization might embolden their children or glorify the enemy, yet most were overwhelmed by relief and hope. One German mother wrote, "If only the war could end like this, with laughter and shared songs, instead of gunfire and tears. Perhaps there is still a chance for our sons to return home, alive and human." These reflections demonstrate the emotional complexity of the truce. It was at once a source of comfort, a reminder of what was lost, and a poignant reflection on the futility and cruelty of ongoing conflict. Newspapers and periodicals quickly picked up the story, spreading it far beyond the immediate locales of the trenches. Illustrated papers ran sketches of soldiers exchanging gifts and playing football, accompanied by stories emphasizing bravery, humanity, and the miracle of temporary peace. These accounts, though sometimes romanticized, contributed to the cultural memory of the truce and allowed civilians to engage with it as both news and a moral lesson. For many readers, the idea that men in mud-filled trenches could pause to share humanity offered a striking contrast to the reports of carnage and death that dominated headlines. The cultural ripple effects also extended into art, music, and literature. Poems were written commemorating the truce, capturing both its whimsy and its melancholy. Carols and songs composed by civilians reflected a longing for peace and an acknowledgement of soldiers' shared humanity, even across national divides. These creative responses transformed the truce from a localized military event into a symbol of hope, morality, and the enduring human spirit. It became a reference point for understanding war, reminding generations that compassion could exist even amidst overwhelming violence. Interestingly, the truce also had an unintended psychological effect on the wider civilian population. It highlighted the arbitrariness and tragedy of war. Knowing that soldiers could pause, laugh, and recognize each other's humanity, civilians began to question the continuation of hostilities. Letters and editorials reveal a growing tension between the need to support national objectives and the visceral awareness that the enemy, too, was composed of fathers, sons, and brothers. In this sense, the Christmas Truce of 1914 functioned as a mirror, reflecting back to the home front the moral dilemmas, emotional stakes, and human costs of the conflict. Ultimately, the impact of the Christmas truce on civilians underscores the profound connection between frontline events and home front perception. While soldiers experienced moments of shared joy and fleeting camaraderie, their families, neighbors, and communities absorbed these stories and were affected emotionally in ways that reached far beyond the trenches. The truce became a moral touchstone, a reminder that even in the darkest times, human beings could act with kindness, courage, and empathy. It was, in effect, a moment of shared humanity, witnessed not just by soldiers, but by the world beyond the front lines, inspiring hope and reflection that lasted long after the guns fell silent. 6. After the bells fell silent. Returning to war and the psychological toll. The ephemeral peace of the Christmas truce of 1914 did not last beyond the holidays, and by the first week of January, the familiar cacophony of gunfire, artillery, and trench combat returned. For soldiers who had experienced the strange intimacy of shared songs, games, and handshakes with the enemy, the resumption of violence carried a profound psychological impact. The stark contrast between the humanity they had glimpsed and the brutality they once again faced left many men grappling with emotional dissonance, moral ambiguity, and an intensified awareness of the randomness and cruelty of war. Understanding this transitional period reveals not only the psychological resilience of soldiers, but also the limitations imposed by military hierarchy, discipline, and the inexorable demands of strategy and national loyalty. The first few days after the truce were filled with confusion, introspection, and in some cases, guilt. Soldiers had seen their so-called enemies as people with families, fears, and desires strikingly similar to their own. Letters from the front reveal a mixture of awe and sorrow, as men recounted the sudden shift from camaraderie back to combat. One British private wrote home, "Yesterday we laughed and exchanged gifts. Today we are ordered to kill or be killed. I cannot help but wonder why we are enemies at all." This sudden psychological reversal challenged traditional notions of duty, loyalty, and the dehumanization that military propaganda relied upon to sustain morale. Soldiers had seen that the enemy could be kind, humorous, and human, and yet they were back in the mud, armed and expected to inflict violence without hesitation. For many soldiers, the mental strain of this transition was compounded by physical exhaustion. The winter of 1914 to 1915 was harsh, with freezing temperatures, rain, and thick mud making movement laborious and trench living perilous. Soldiers were already dealing with frostbite, malnutrition, and the threat of disease, and the abrupt shift from shared holiday cheer to the relentless demands of trench warfare amplified stress levels. Historical accounts note that some men struggled with sleep disturbances, nightmares, and irritability, a response that modern psychologists might describe as acute stress reaction, or early manifestations of what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The juxtaposition of brief moments of human connection with the ongoing violence created a cognitive and emotional strain that was difficult to reconcile. Commanders, aware of the potential for such fraternization to undermine discipline, acted quickly to reassert control. Orders were issued prohibiting further interactions with enemy forces, and the distribution of propaganda was intensified to reinforce the image of the enemy as a threat that must be defeated. Reports from officers indicate that some soldiers were reprimanded for lingering in no man's land, or for attempting to continue the exchange of gifts or pleasantries. In many ways, the military hierarchy viewed the truce as an anomaly, a dangerous blurring of lines that could weaken obedience, morale, and the overall effectiveness of the front line. The psychological tension soldiers experienced was therefore not only internal, but also externally reinforced by commands emphasizing fear, duty, and national loyalty. Despite these pressures, the memories of the truce lingered in the minds of soldiers, shaping interpersonal relationships, coping mechanisms, and attitudes toward the enemy. Many men reported a newfound empathy for their opponents, describing small acts of kindness or hesitation during combat that reflected the humanity they had witnessed. Some accounts mention soldiers deliberately avoiding unnecessary violence or showing mercy to wounded enemies, demonstrating how even a fleeting moment of peace could influence behavior in the field. These actions, though sporadic and often subtle, underscore the resilience of human compassion, even in the face of institutionalized violence. The return to warfare also highlighted the role of memory and storytelling in sustaining morale and emotional well-being. Soldiers recounted tales of the truce to their comrades, sometimes embellishing or romanticizing events, but always emphasizing the possibility of human connection amidst suffering. These narratives served multiple purposes. They reinforced bonds among soldiers, provided psychological relief, and acted as a quiet form of resistance against the dehumanizing logic of war. By remembering the truce, soldiers maintained a sense of moral grounding, a reminder that the enemy was not a faceless abstraction, but a human being with whom they had shared laughter, music, and fleeting fellowship. Interestingly, the resumption of hostilities revealed the paradoxical interplay between memory and reality in war. Soldiers were forced to reconcile the idealized, almost magical moments of the truce with the harsh, unrelenting demands of combat. For some, this created feelings of disillusionment, as the temporary peace underscored the senselessness of continued conflict. For others, it reinforced a sense of duty and resilience, as surviving and enduring the war became a way to honor both their fallen comrades and the fleeting moments of humanity they had experienced. In this sense, the truce functioned as both a psychological balm and a haunting reminder of what war took from individuals, families, and nations. Civilian populations, meanwhile, noticed the abrupt return to violence through letters and newspapers, which documented both the persistence of the war and the moral complexities experienced by the soldiers. Families wrote with concern about their loved ones, acknowledging the emotional strain induced by the truce and its aftermath. Communities reflected on the contrast between hope and suffering, using the truce as a symbol of the tension between humanity and destruction that defined the war as a whole. In literature and poetry, these themes began to emerge more clearly, as writers grappled with the juxtaposition of kindness and brutality, empathy and obedience, memory and reality. The psychological impact of returning to combat also extended into tactics, as both sides adjusted strategies to prevent future fraternizations. Nighttime raids, increased surveillance, and stricter regulations in the trenches were implemented to enforce discipline and maintain focus on military objectives. Soldiers, while understanding the necessity of these measures, often felt conflicted, recognizing the tension between human impulses and institutional demands. The struggle to navigate this balance became a defining feature of trench life, illustrating how moments of moral clarity and shared humanity could coexist uneasily with the machinery of war. In the months following the truce, historians and psychologists have observed that the event shaped long-term perceptions of war among participants. Veterans who survived the remainder of the conflict often recalled the Christmas Truce as a touchstone for understanding human nature, morality, and the capacity for empathy, even under the most extreme circumstances. The truce became a benchmark against which soldiers measured subsequent experiences, a reminder that even in a war defined by slaughter, there existed opportunities for reconciliation, understanding, and shared humanity. Ultimately, the return to hostilities after the Christmas Truce of 1914 highlights the fragility of peace, the resilience of human compassion, and the complex psychological terrain navigated by soldiers in the trenches. The fleeting moments of shared laughter, music, and camaraderie became indelible memories that informed behavior, attitudes, and ethical considerations throughout the war. Though guns once again roared and orders demanded obedience, the truce remained a testament to the enduring human spirit, reminding both soldiers and civilians alike that empathy, connection, and moral reflection could survive even amidst the most relentless violence. 7. Letters, Memories, and the Legacy of a Brief Peace. The Christmas Truce of 1914 was not merely a singular event in the frozen mud of the Western Front. It became an enduring memory for soldiers and civilians alike, preserved in letters, diaries, and oral histories. These documents reveal the inner lives of men who, for a brief time, had abandoned enmity in favor of humanity. As winter tightened its grip and combat resumed, letters sent home captured both the wonder and the melancholy of the truce, illustrating how memory and narrative served as lifelines in the dehumanizing landscape of trench warfare. The act of recording these experiences allowed soldiers to process their emotions, share their humanity with distant loved ones, and assert the existence of compassion, even amid a conflict defined by cruelty. One British soldier, writing to his family, described the surreal scene of singing carols across no man's land and exchanging chocolates and cigarettes with German soldiers. It was as if the world had paused, if only for a few hours, he wrote, and I saw that men could be friends, not enemies. Letters such as these became windows into moments of temporary peace, documenting the shared humanity of adversaries and the fleeting beauty that could exist, even in a battlefield. For many soldiers, the act of writing served as both catharsis and resistance, an affirmation that empathy and morality had not been entirely eroded by war. These letters also reveal the emotional complexity experienced by soldiers who returned to the realities of combat after the truce. They often contained contradictions, blending joy, awe, guilt, and sorrow. A German corporal wrote home about the discomfort of returning to his trench after shaking hands with the enemy, expressing a sense of dissonance between the friendship he had experienced and the orders to kill that awaited him the next day. Such accounts reflect the broader psychological tension soldiers faced, the ability to recognize common humanity on one day and participate in violence the next. Memory of the truce thus became both a blessing and a burden, a reminder of what could have been, and a measure of the ethical compromises imposed by war. The act of storytelling and letter writing extended beyond the soldiers themselves. Families preserved these narratives, sometimes reprinting them in local newspapers or recounting them to neighbors. Civilian audiences interpreted the truce as a moral and spiritual lesson, an example of the potential for reconciliation, even amidst the worst of conflicts. These stories became part of a shared cultural memory, emphasizing ideals of empathy, forgiveness, and common humanity. In some cases, they inspired poetry, songs, and reflections that framed the truce as a symbolic resistance to the mechanized, dehumanized nature of modern warfare. Importantly, these letters also captured the broader social and historical context of the soldiers' experiences. The truce occurred during a particularly grim winter, when food was scarce, trenches were waterlogged, and frostbite was a constant threat. Soldiers Letters often described not only the joy of temporary peace, but also the harsh physical realities of trench life. One account recounted how men, while exchanging gifts, slipped in the mud or shivered uncontrollably as the wind cut through their uniforms. The juxtaposition of warmth, both emotional and through shared gifts, with physical suffering, highlights the resilience and resourcefulness of soldiers who found joy in the smallest gestures. The legacy of the truce also illustrates the tension between individual memory and institutional narrative. Military authorities often sought to downplay or suppress accounts of fraternization, fearing that widespread knowledge of such events could undermine discipline or morale. Orders were issued prohibiting communication with enemy forces, and propaganda reinforced the image of the opposing side as a threatening, dehumanized other. Despite this, letters and diaries preserved a record of the human impulse toward connection, demonstrating the persistence of empathy and the subversive potential of memory. Soldiers became inadvertent historians of their own experiences, documenting moments that would otherwise have been erased by military bureaucracy. Beyond individual and familial memory, the truce influenced collective narratives of World War I. Historians, journalists, and later filmmakers drew on these letters to craft stories emphasizing the tension between humanity and warfare. The truce served as a moral counterpoint to the staggering scale of death and destruction, illustrating that even in industrialized conflict, individual choices and human agency remained significant. By studying these letters, researchers gain insight into the psychological, social, and ethical dimensions of combat, and the ways in which personal memory intersects with broader historical narratives. Moreover, the letters reveal the subtle ways in which soldiers used the memory of the truce to navigate ethical dilemmas during ongoing combat. Some accounts mention deliberate restraint in firing at enemy positions or small acts of mercy toward wounded foes, inspired by their prior experience of shared humanity. These behaviors were not universal, but they demonstrate how memory can shape moral conduct, even in situations structured to reward obedience and violence. The truce, therefore, functioned as both a historical event and a moral compass, reminding participants of the capacity for empathy and ethical reflection under extreme conditions. The enduring power of these letters lies in their intimacy. They often contain minute details that convey the texture of the experience. The smell of smoke mixing with the scent of pine from a tree cut down for the truce, the sound of carols drifting across the trenches, or the warmth of a shared blanket or scarf. Such sensory recollections transform the historical record from abstract events to lived experiences, allowing contemporary readers to glimpse the humanity of soldiers and the fleeting moments of beauty that punctuated the horrors of war. Letters from the truce also serve as evidence of the emotional intelligence and resilience of soldiers. They negotiated fear, danger, and ethical ambiguity, yet still recognized the value of friendship, shared music, and small pleasures. These written records provide insight into how humans maintain moral and emotional awareness in circumstances that might otherwise compel numbness or brutality. The letters reveal a capacity for reflection, empathy, and narrative shaping that transcends the immediate context of combat, offering lessons in psychology, ethics, and human connection. Finally, the preservation and study of these letters underscore the importance of memory in constructing historical understanding. While official records focus on tactics, casualties, and orders, personal narratives illuminate the lived realities of war, capturing the nuances of emotion, decision-making, and moral reasoning. The Christmas Truce of 1914, as remembered in these letters, is not just a story of a temporary cessation of violence. It is a testament to the resilience of human compassion, the enduring power of memory, and the moral complexity that defines life in extreme circumstances. The letters, therefore, are not merely historical artifacts. They are living testimonies to the human spirit, revealing how individuals find meaning, empathy, and connection, even in the darkest chapters of history. In reading them, we witness the paradox of war, that amidst destruction and fear, acts of kindness, courage, and understanding can shine with enduring brilliance. 8. Music, sport, and shared rituals in the trenches. The Christmas Truce of 1914 was not only marked by letters and exchanges of gifts, but also by a remarkable revival of cultural and social practices among soldiers, particularly through music, sport, and shared rituals. These activities provided a temporary reprieve from the relentless stress and monotony of trench life, allowing soldiers to reclaim fragments of civilian identity and humanity amidst the violence and suffering of World War I. Beyond the mere cessation of gunfire, these shared experiences forged fleeting but profound connections, demonstrating the power of culture and play as mechanisms for psychological relief and social cohesion. Music played a central role in the truce, as soldiers spontaneously organized caroling in small concerts. British troops reported singing familiar Christmas carols such as Silent Night and O Come All Ye Faithful, while German soldiers responded with their own traditional songs, creating a cross-cultural musical dialogue. These moments were often accompanied by improvised instruments, an old fiddle, a makeshift drum, or even the tapping of bayonets on wooden crates. Music offered a familiar anchor in an otherwise alien environment, evoking memories of home and family, while fostering a sense of shared humanity between adversaries. In the silence of no man's land, melodies became messages, transcending language and political boundaries, to remind men that they were more than soldiers. They were sons, brothers, and fathers. Sporting activities, particularly impromptu football matches, also characterized the truce. Accounts describe men from opposing sides arranging makeshift games on muddy patches of no man's land, using whatever objects were available as goalposts. These matches were surprisingly organized, reflecting both the resourcefulness and the competitive spirit of the soldiers. Football, in this context, became a neutral ground, an arena in which adversaries could engage in friendly competition without the lethal consequences of warfare. The games served multiple functions. They maintained physical fitness, provided entertainment, and reinforced social bonds across enemy lines. The imagery of soldiers kicking a ball amidst barbed wire and shell craters illustrates the surreal juxtaposition of normalcy and war, humor and horror, sport and survival. Shared rituals extended beyond music and sport, encompassing collective acts of commemoration, prayer, and festive decoration. Some soldiers brought small Christmas trees, candles, or homemade ornaments to their trenches, creating ephemeral spaces of beauty and reflection amid the desolation. These rituals allowed men to assert agency in a highly controlled environment, crafting moments of meaning in the face of existential uncertainty. Religious observances, though often intermingled with secular customs, also played a role. Soldiers recited prayers together or held brief services, sometimes crossing no man's land to include the enemy in their acts of devotion. These rituals were less about doctrine than about human connection, moral reassurance, and the preservation of dignity in the face of chaos. The role of food and small gifts in these rituals was equally significant. Soldiers shared rations, chocolates, tobacco, and even alcohol, negotiating exchanges that reflected both generosity and diplomacy. Such acts were rarely formalized. They emerged organically, relying on mutual trust and the shared recognition of the extraordinary circumstances. Food and drink, basic as they were, became symbols of hospitality and fraternity, reminding men of the common needs and pleasures that transcended national or military divisions. The exchange of gifts reinforced the idea that even enemies could find common ground, if only temporarily, and provided a small but potent antidote to the dehumanizing routines of trench life. Importantly, these cultural and social practices were embedded within the broader psychological landscape of soldiers' experiences. The truce occurred after months of physical exhaustion, hunger, and constant exposure to danger. The temporary suspension of violence, combined with music, sport, and ritual, provided a unique form of emotional regulation, allowing soldiers to process trauma, alleviate anxiety, and maintain a sense of identity. By engaging in familiar activities, soldiers reclaimed aspects of civilian life, reaffirming their sense of self and agency. These experiences illustrate the profound resilience of human psychology, highlighting the capacity for creativity, play, and empathy even in extreme conditions. The significance of these activities also extends to the documentation and memory of the truce. Soldiers' letters and diaries frequently highlight the vividness of musical performances, football matches, and ritual observances. These accounts emphasize not only the novelty of the events, but also the emotional impact, capturing moments of joy, camaraderie, and wonder. For historians and psychologists, these narratives provide insight into how humans adapt to extreme stress and how cultural practices serve as mechanisms for emotional survival. They reveal the interplay between environment, ritual, and morality, demonstrating that even brief interludes of normalcy can have lasting psychological and cultural significance. Moreover, music, sport, and ritual functioned as forms of silent diplomacy. The truce was, after all, an unsanctioned event, occurring without the approval of commanding officers. Through these practices, soldiers negotiated temporary ceasefires and established informal codes of conduct, asserting control over their immediate circumstances. In this sense, the truce was a microcosm of human agency in wartime, a demonstration that social and cultural tools can mediate conflict and foster mutual understanding, even under the most adverse conditions. The shared experiences transcended language barriers, political ideologies, and military hierarchies, highlighting the universal appeal and efficacy of communal rituals in building trust and reducing hostility. The visual and sensory dimensions of these moments also contributed to their lasting impression. Imagine men singing carols across muddy craters, exchanging gifts while smoke rises from distant artillery, or competing in a football match that turns no man's land into a surreal playing field. The contrast between the beauty of these acts and the devastation surrounding them intensifies their emotional and symbolic weight. These images, recorded in letters, photographs, and later recollections, have become iconic representations of the truce, encapsulating the paradoxical coexistence of humanity and horror in World War I. Finally, the cultural and social aspects of the truce offer enduring lessons for understanding human behavior in conflict. Music, sport, and ritual provided soldiers with psychological relief, social connection, and moral reflection, underscoring the importance of shared activities in fostering empathy and resilience. These practices demonstrate that even in structured and violent environments, humans can create spaces of joy, cooperation, and ethical engagement. The Christmas Truce of 1914 thus becomes more than an extraordinary historical event. It becomes a case study in the power of culture, ritual, and play to preserve humanity in extreme circumstances. 9. The aftermath. Memories, letters, and the long shadow of the truce. The Christmas Truce of 1914 did not end with the final echoes of carols or the last kick of a football on the muddy battlefield. Its effects rippled through the personal memories of soldiers, the written records they left behind, and the way the event was remembered, or sometimes deliberately forgotten, by both sides. The aftermath of the truce provides insight into the enduring psychological, cultural, and historical significance of this extraordinary pause in hostilities. Understanding how the truce was documented and interpreted illuminates the fragile interplay between individual memory, collective experience, and historical narrative, showing how even a few days of peace can resonate across decades. For many soldiers, letters home became the primary medium for conveying the experience of the truce. Men described in vivid detail the surreal nature of meeting the enemy in no man's land, singing carols together, exchanging gifts, and participating in football matches. These letters often emphasized not just the novelty of the events, but their emotional impact. Soldiers recounted feelings of disbelief, joy, and relief, highlighting the sharp contrast between the horrors of trench warfare and the fleeting moments of camaraderie. Some letters conveyed an almost dreamlike quality to the truce, as if the ordinary rules of life and death had been suspended for a brief, miraculous interlude. Diaries and memoirs further enriched the historical record, offering more reflective and personal accounts. In these narratives, soldiers explored not only the actions of the truce, but their internal reactions, grappling with the paradox of friendship amidst warfare. They pondered the absurdity of the conflict, questioned the rationale for the violence that followed, and occasionally expressed guilt for feeling empathy toward the enemy. These writings reveal the profound psychological effects of shared humanity in wartime. The truce forced soldiers to confront moral and emotional dimensions that were otherwise suppressed in daily survival. The diaries also provide important details about the cultural exchanges, from the songs sung in various languages to the improvised decorations and communal meals shared across trenches. Interestingly, the response of military authorities to the truce shaped its long-term memory. In many cases, commanders were quick to discourage such fraternization, fearing it undermined discipline and combat effectiveness. Orders were issued to prevent further truces, and in some cases, soldiers who participated were reprimanded. This official discouragement contributed to the rarity of subsequent truces and influenced the way the 1914 Christmas pause was remembered. While soldiers celebrated and documented their experiences, official histories often minimized or omitted these moments, framing the war in terms of strategy and sacrifice rather than human connection. This tension between personal memory and institutional narrative adds a layer of complexity to our understanding of the truce and its significance. Post-war recollections, both written and oral, also shaped the legacy of the truce. Veterans' accounts collected decades later emphasized the surreal and almost magical quality of the events, portraying them as a symbol of hope, morality, and the possibility of peace, even amidst the most violent conditions. These recollections often included romanticized or idealized details, such as perfectly organized football matches, harmonious caroling, or elaborate gift exchanges. While historians have debated the accuracy of certain anecdotes, the enduring power of these stories lies less in factual precision than in their symbolic resonance. They became metaphors for humanity triumphing over hatred, illustrating that even in the darkest moments, cooperation and empathy are possible. Another aspect of the aftermath concerns the broader public perception. Newspapers and magazines, once the war was underway, sometimes reported on the truce, highlighting the extraordinary nature of the event. These accounts often emphasized the human interest angle, appealing to readers' emotions and curiosity. However, reporting was inconsistent, and wartime censorship sometimes limited the spread of information about fraternization with the enemy. In the years following the war, the truce became a touchstone for discussions about the futility of conflict, the possibility of reconciliation, and the moral responsibilities of individuals, even in institutionalized violence. Its presence in collective memory illustrates how a single event can shape cultural narratives long after the immediate circumstances have passed. The aftermath also included artistic and literary responses, reflecting the truce's symbolic power. Poets, painters, and later filmmakers drew inspiration from these moments of suspended violence, portraying them as emblematic of the human spirit's resilience. Artistic representations often focused on the striking contrast between the desolation of the trenches and the beauty of music, sport, and mutual aid. The truce became a lens through which creators explored themes of morality, empathy, and the absurdity of war. These artistic interpretations reinforced the truce's status as both a historical event and a cultural myth, bridging the gap between fact and symbolic meaning. Psychologically, the memories of the truce had lasting effects on many soldiers. Accounts suggest that the experience of temporary peace could deepen reflection on the reasons for the war and increase longing for post-war reconciliation. Conversely, the rapid return to combat after the truce sometimes intensified trauma, as men who had shared moments of camaraderie with the enemy were forced to confront death and destruction once more. The duality of joy and subsequent suffering left a profound imprint on soldiers' emotional lives, influencing how they remembered the war and how they spoke about it in letters, diaries, and interviews. Finally, the long-term significance of the truce lies in its ability to humanize historical memory. In a war often defined by mass casualties, strategy, and destruction, the Christmas Truce of 1914 stands out as a reminder that individual choices and acts of empathy can resonate beyond the immediate context. The aftermath, preserved in letters, diaries, newspaper reports, artistic works, and oral histories, serves as a testament to the enduring power of small gestures, shared culture, and fleeting peace. It reminds us that even in systemic violence, humans retain the capacity for connection, kindness, and moral reflection, leaving a legacy that continues to inspire and educate generations. 10. Remembering the truce. Monuments, museums, and modern commemorations. The Christmas Truce of 1914, though fleeting in duration, has left an indelible mark not only in historical records, but also in the physical and cultural landscape of memory. Over the decades, efforts to commemorate this extraordinary pause in one of history's deadliest conflicts have taken many forms, ranging from monuments erected on former battlefields to museum exhibitions and annual ceremonies that bring the story to life for contemporary audiences. These commemorations illuminate the truce's enduring resonance and reflect a broader human desire to remember moments of peace amid devastation. They also offer insights into how societies construct collective memory, choosing which aspects of history to honor and which to interpret symbolically. In the countries that experienced the truce firsthand, battlefield memorials and plaques mark the sites of these historic fraternizations. In northern France and Belgium, small markers and local monuments remind visitors where soldiers from opposing sides laid down their arms, exchanged gifts, or played football. These markers often emphasize human connection rather than military achievement, underscoring the moral significance of the events. Some plaques incorporate quotes from soldiers' letters or diaries, allowing visitors to hear the voices of those who participated and creating a sense of intimate, personal history. By situating commemoration within the landscape itself, these monuments provide a tangible connection to the past, making history physically present in the same fields where empathy once triumphed over hostility. Museums have also played a vital role in preserving the memory of the truce. Exhibitions in institutions such as the Imperial War Museum in London or the In Flanders Fields Museum in Ypres curate artifacts, photographs, and personal letters that capture the truce's extraordinary character. These exhibitions often recreate trench environments or provide interactive experiences, enabling visitors to step into the soldier's world and experience, if only symbolically, the surreal peace of December 1914. By highlighting personal stories alongside historical context, museums frame the truce not merely as an anecdotal curiosity, but as a meaningful moment that illuminates broader themes of human resilience, morality, and the possibility of compassion in wartime. Annual commemorations and reenactments have become increasingly popular, particularly on milestone anniversaries. On December 24th and 25th, groups in Europe and beyond organize events that mimic aspects of the original truce, from singing traditional carols to staging friendly football matches on former battlefields. These modern enactments serve multiple purposes. They educate the public about history, celebrate the values of peace and empathy, and reinforce the cultural memory of the truce. Importantly, they also act as symbolic reminders that even amidst conflict, ordinary individuals can make choices that affirm humanity. In literature and media, the truce continues to inspire creative interpretations. Novels, documentaries, and films have portrayed the event with varying degrees of historical fidelity, often highlighting the emotional and moral dimensions rather than focusing solely on factual detail. For instance, films depict soldiers from both sides cautiously stepping into no man's land, tentative gestures of friendship gradually giving way to laughter, shared meals, and impromptu games. These portrayals reinforce the symbolic power of the truce, emphasizing its timeless lesson that empathy can exist even in the midst of immense suffering. Educational programs, particularly in schools, have further cemented the truce's legacy. Teachers use letters, photographs, and first-hand accounts to illustrate the human dimensions of war, demonstrating to students how history is not solely shaped by strategies and politics, but also by individual decisions and moral choices. Lessons on the Christmas Truce often highlight the importance of understanding the enemy as a fellow human being, fostering discussion about conflict resolution, empathy, and the consequences of war. By integrating the truce into educational narratives, Societies ensure that future generations recognize both the horrors of conflict and the potential for compassion. International organizations and commemorative projects have also embraced the truce as a symbol of cross-cultural understanding. In some cases, peace initiatives draw directly on the story of soldiers from different nations, pausing hostilities to celebrate common traditions, emphasizing the possibility of unity in contemporary conflicts. These efforts show that the truce is not simply a historical curiosity, but a living symbol of hope, adaptable to modern contexts where dialogue and reconciliation are essential. Interestingly, the truce has occasionally sparked debates about memory and myth-making. Some historians question the accuracy of certain accounts, suggesting that romanticized portrayals of football matches or perfect camaraderie may exaggerate reality. Nevertheless, these debates do not diminish the significance of the truce. Rather, they highlight how historical events become layered with cultural meaning. The mythic aspects of the truce serve to amplify its message that even a brief pause in violence can have lasting moral and emotional significance. By engaging with both fact and interpretation, societies negotiate the boundaries between memory, history, and cultural narrative. Commemorations also underscore the role of material culture in memory. Objects exchanged during the truce, chocolates, cigarettes, or handmade gifts, have been preserved in museum collections, giving tangible form to acts of generosity. These artifacts illustrate the personal dimensions of the truce, reminding us that history is composed not only of grand strategies and political decisions, but also of small, intimate gestures. Holding or viewing such items evokes the lived experience of soldiers, providing a sensory connection to the past that complements textual and visual records. The legacy of the Christmas Truce ultimately rests in its enduring capacity to inspire reflection and moral imagination. It challenges conventional narratives of war, emphasizing that humanity persists even in extreme conditions. Monuments, museums, reenactments, literature, and educational programs collectively ensure that the story remains vivid, offering a reminder that peace is not solely the product of treaties or political negotiations, but also of everyday choices, courage, and empathy. The truce, preserved in collective memory, continues to resonate because it affirms a timeless truth. Even in darkness, human connection can shine as a light, guiding future generations toward understanding, compassion, and the possibility of reconciliation. 11 personal accounts, letters, diaries, and eyewitness memories. One of the most compelling ways we understand the Christmas Truce of 1914 is through the personal accounts left behind by the soldiers themselves. Letters sent home, diary entries carefully tucked away in knapsacks, and later memoirs provide vivid glimpses into the surreal experience of a war temporarily suspended. These first-hand narratives allow modern readers to step into the trenches, feel the cold bite of winter, hear the distant artillery, and then experience the almost miraculous peace that emerged on that December Christmas. They reveal not just the facts of what happened, but also the emotional texture, the fear, the surprise, the cautious joy, and the fleeting hope that flickered amid chaos. Soldiers' letters often describe the initial suspicion of enemy movements. Many soldiers reported seeing figures, cautiously emerging from the opposing trenches, hands raised or waving, with the universal gesture of peace signaling that no bullets were to be fired. One British private wrote home that we could hardly believe our eyes when the Germans stepped out singing carols in the cold twilight, emphasizing both the strangeness and the beauty of the moment. Across the lines, Germans and British soldiers exchanged greetings, sometimes in broken phrases, sometimes through gestures and smiles, discovering in each other a shared humanity despite national allegiances. These simple communications, preserved in carefully penned letters, capture a sense of wonder at the unexpected truce. Diaries often provide more reflective accounts, capturing the psychological and moral dimensions of the event. A Belgian soldier, for example, noted how the sudden cessation of hostilities made us question everything we had been taught about the enemy. He reflected that, for a brief window, the rigid dichotomy of friend and foe dissolved, leaving space for empathy and mutual recognition. Diaries frequently recount acts of generosity, soldiers sharing rations of chocolate or cigarettes, helping to repair each other's trenches, or even exchanging small tokens such as buttons or badges. These details, intimate and concrete, illuminate the human impulse toward connection even amid the machinery of war. One of the most enduring aspects described in these accounts is the impromptu football matches that reportedly took place. Letters and diaries from both sides depict soldiers kicking makeshift balls across no man's land, laughter and shouts momentarily replacing the usual sounds of artillery and gunfire. While the exact details of these games are debated, the consistency across multiple accounts suggests that some form of playful interaction did occur. These anecdotes have become emblematic of the truce, symbolizing the triumph of human spirit and camaraderie over violence. Eyewitness memoirs written after the war provide yet another layer of insight. These accounts often blend personal memory with broader historical reflection, capturing both the small, tangible gestures and the larger symbolic significance of the truce. Some veterans wrote decades later about how the experience shaped their views of the enemy and the war itself. A German soldier recalled that for one night, we were not enemies, but neighbors under the same cold sky, sharing songs and stories. Such recollections emphasize the emotional resonance of the truce, highlighting its enduring moral and psychological impact. Personal accounts also document the fleeting nature of the truce and the inevitable return to hostilities. Letters frequently describe the bittersweet moments of parting, the uneasy silence as soldiers retreated to their trenches, and the resumption of the war that seemed to erase the fragile camaraderie. One British officer noted, "As the dawn came, we exchanged reluctant farewells, knowing that by nightfall we would be firing at each other once more." These reflections underscore the poignancy of the truce. It was at once miraculous and ephemeral, a brief oasis of humanity within an otherwise relentless conflict. Many letters and diaries also convey the emotional aftermath for the soldiers. The memory of shared carols, football matches, and gifts haunted some soldiers, creating a lingering sense of loss and longing. These personal reflections suggest that, while the truce was a temporary cessation of hostilities, its moral and emotional imprint endured far longer. For some, it became a source of hope, evidence that even in the most brutal conditions, compassion and understanding were possible. For others, it highlighted the cruel reality that war often suppresses these qualities, forcing soldiers to return to violence despite the knowledge of their shared humanity. The preservation and study of these documents also reveal the challenges of historical memory. Many letters were never sent, diaries were lost or destroyed, and recollections written after the war were inevitably influenced by time and trauma. Historians must piece together these fragments carefully, balancing skepticism with respect for the human voices they represent. Despite these challenges, the surviving accounts collectively form a mosaic of experiences that allows contemporary audiences to glimpse the extraordinary nature of the truce. They provide a richness of detail that goes beyond statistics, revealing the lived experience of soldiers caught between duty, fear, and fleeting moments of peace. In addition to individual narratives, collective accounts, such as regimental histories or community commemorations, offer insights into how groups experienced and remembered the truce. Some regiments documented the fraternization in official records, emphasizing the discipline and order in which it occurred. Others focused on the human side, recounting how soldiers maintained bonds of friendship across enemy lines, even as the broader machinery of war resumed. Together, these collective and personal documents provide a nuanced understanding of the truce, capturing both the extraordinary and the ordinary aspects of the event. The study of letters, diaries, and eyewitness accounts also demonstrates the power of storytelling in shaping historical memory. Through these personal narratives, the Christmas Truce has transcended its immediate historical context to become a symbol of hope and humanity. Readers and historians alike are drawn into the trenches, experiencing the sights, sounds, and emotions of a moment when ordinary individuals chose peace over conflict. The truce, as recorded in these intimate documents, reminds us that history is not only about battles and political decisions, but also about the choices, gestures, and moral reflections of the individuals who lived it. Ultimately, these personal accounts form the emotional core of the Christmas Truce. They allow us to hear the voices of soldiers who, for a brief and magical time, bridged enemy lines with empathy, laughter, and shared humanity. By preserving these letters, diaries, and memoirs, we are able to connect with the lived experience of history, experiencing not only the facts, but the feelings, hopes, and moral courage that made the truce possible. Through these intimate narratives, the Christmas Truce of 1914 continues to speak across the decades, a testament to the enduring power of human connection in even the darkest of times. 12. Music across no man's land. Carols, songs, and shared humanity. Music played a profoundly symbolic role in the Christmas Truce of 1914, serving as both a bridge between enemies and a marker of shared cultural experience. In the frozen, desolate expanse of no man's land, the sounds of Christmas carols, chants, and familiar songs carried a remarkable weight. Soldiers on both sides reported hearing the strains of music rising from the opposite trenches, initially with suspicion, then with recognition, and finally with a sense of communion. The melodies, often simple and familiar, transcended language barriers and national allegiances, creating a temporary space where the humanity of the other side could be acknowledged and celebrated. The earliest reports suggest that music was one of the first signs of fraternization. German soldiers, known for their strong traditions of Christmas singing, reportedly began by singing carols such as Stille Nacht, Silent Night, across the lines. British and French troops, hearing the distant voices, responded with their own songs, creating an impromptu duet across the battlefield. Soldiers described the eerie beauty of these soundscapes, familiar tunes echoing over mud, barbed wire, and frozen earth, bringing warmth and a fleeting sense of normalcy to an otherwise grim setting. The carols were more than entertainment. They were a declaration of shared culture, a reminder that even in the midst of war, the soldiers were connected by common humanity. Letters and diaries reveal how deeply these musical exchanges affected the participants. One British private wrote, "We could hear them singing, and though I did not understand every word, I felt their hearts speaking the same language as ours." Another German soldier noted that the singing made the enemy seem less like the faceless adversaries portrayed in propaganda, and more like neighbors sharing in a common ritual. Music in this context functioned as a language of empathy, capable of conveying emotions that words alone could not. Beyond carols, some accounts describe soldiers playing musical instruments across the lines. Harmonicas, fiddles, and even makeshift percussion were used to create melodies that were both playful and profoundly moving. In some instances, small groups of soldiers from both sides gathered in the shallow expanse between trenches to sing and play together. These impromptu musical ensembles were acts of extraordinary courage and humanity. Stepping into no man's land without immediate military purpose was risky. Yet music created a protective social space where fear was temporarily suspended. The role of music in fostering the truce extended beyond emotional connection. In many accounts, singing became a way to test the intentions of the opposing soldiers. One diary entry from a French soldier recounts hearing the Germans sing carols, pausing to assess whether the gesture was genuine. The recognition that the singing was meant as an olive branch rather than a lure for attack provided reassurance, gradually building trust across the battlefield. Music, in this sense, functioned as both social and moral communication, signaling peaceful intentions in a setting defined by suspicion and danger. Music also influenced the spontaneous celebrations that followed. Shared carols were often accompanied by other small rituals, the exchange of chocolate, tobacco, or small gifts, the inspection of enemy trenches in a spirit of camaraderie, and in some cases, the impromptu football matches that have become legendary. Songs served as a unifying thread, tying together acts of play, generosity, and mutual recognition. Accounts from multiple regiments note that the rhythm of the carols created a sense of structure and order amid the chaotic landscape, allowing soldiers to coordinate gestures of friendship across barbed wire and shell holes. Eyewitness memoirs, written decades later, emphasize the enduring memory of music during the truce. One veteran recalled, "Even after the war ended, I could hear their voices singing Silent Night across the mud and frost. It was as if the sound had etched itself into my memory forever." The vividness of these recollections underscores the emotional impact of music. It became a mnemonic device, embedding the experience of temporary peace into the consciousness of those who lived through it. For many soldiers, music provided a psychological anchor, a momentary reprieve from fear, exhaustion, and the constant threat of death. Historical research into the Christmas Truce has shown that music was more than incidental. It shaped the sequence and tone of the events. Music allowed soldiers to emerge from their trenches, provided a basis for negotiation and social interaction, and acted as a vehicle for expressing shared cultural identity. The sounds of singing and playing instruments signaled that, even amid industrialized warfare, human creativity and empathy could assert themselves. It transformed a no-man's land of hostility into a space of temporary fellowship, creating a lasting impression that historians continue to study and interpret. Interestingly, the music of the truce also highlights the complexity of cultural exchange during wartime. Soldiers were exposed to foreign melodies and traditions in a deeply personal context, sometimes adopting or mimicking elements from the other side. Some British soldiers attempted to sing German carols, while German troops tried to join in with English hymns. This exchange, though informal, demonstrates that music not only reflected common humanity, but also encouraged mutual curiosity and respect. It became a subtle form of diplomacy, mediated by melody rather than negotiation tables. Finally, music in the Christmas Truce reminds us of the power of intangible experiences in shaping historical memory. While letters, diaries, and official reports provide factual accounts, it is the emotive resonance of songs and carols that lingers most vividly. The memory of music singing across trenches, echoing through frost and fog, continues to inspire reflection on the capacity for human connection, even in the most hostile circumstances. These sounds, ephemeral yet enduring in memory, illustrate the possibility of peace and empathy amidst violence, leaving a legacy that transcends time and geography. 13. Legacy of the Christmas Truce, a message across time. The Christmas Truce of 1914 left a legacy far beyond the fleeting moments of peace in the frozen fields of the Western Front. Though the fighting resumed shortly after, the events of that brief truce reverberated through history, offering a powerful testament to the resilience of human empathy and the enduring hope for peace, even amidst one of the most brutal conflicts in history. It became a symbol of what is possible when ordinary people choose to recognize the humanity in one another, transcending the machinery of war and the strictures of military command. Contemporary accounts, letters, and memoirs reveal that the memory of the truce remained vivid for soldiers long after they returned home. Veterans spoke of it as a moment of miraculous calm, a brief suspension of the war machine in which enemies became neighbors, and music, conversation, and shared games forged bonds that defied national divides. Some recalled the surreal feeling of walking across no man's land, calling greetings to soldiers who only hours before were targets, now allies in laughter, song, and fleeting camaraderie. The legacy of the truce also extended to future generations. Families preserved letters and photographs from the front, passing down stories of soldiers shaking hands, sharing food, and playing football in the mud. These narratives became part of the collective memory of World War I, reminding later generations that even during humanity's darkest moments, acts of kindness and mutual recognition are possible. Schools, historians, and cultural institutions have commemorated the truce, using it as a case study in peace, diplomacy, and the extraordinary ways people can reclaim their humanity in the face of violence. Historians have analyzed the truce to understand its significance in both social and military contexts. The fact that music, carols, and spontaneous gestures could halt aggression illustrates the psychological dimensions of warfare. Soldiers were not merely cogs in a mechanized machine. They were individuals capable of moral judgment, empathy, and creativity. The truce showed that, given the opportunity, humans are inclined to seek connection and understanding, even when powerful forces attempt to compel conflict. This insight challenges the conventional narrative of total obedience in war, highlighting the agency and humanity of those on the front lines. Cultural depictions of the truce have further cemented its place in public imagination. Films, documentaries, novels, and even artistic installations have recreated the moment, emphasizing the surreal beauty of carols echoing across trenches, the shared laughter of soldiers, and the image of men from opposing sides standing shoulder to shoulder in a temporary brotherhood. These artistic renderings serve to humanize a conflict, often reduced to statistics, reminding audiences that the war was fought not just in numbers, but in individual stories, choices, and fleeting moments of grace. One particularly striking aspect of the truce's legacy is its demonstration of the universality of human desires. Soldiers on both sides longed for comfort, companionship, and a brief respite from fear. Their collective actions show that fundamental human needs can surpass ideological or nationalistic divides. This universality resonates today, offering lessons for contemporary conflict resolution and peace building. It suggests that gestures of goodwill, shared music, dialogue, or simple acknowledgement of the other's humanity can have transformative power, even in situations dominated by structural and systemic violence. Furthermore, the truce highlighted the role of memory in shaping historical meaning. While the military hierarchy often attempted to suppress stories of fraternization, fearing that it undermined discipline, these narratives survived through personal letters, diaries, and oral histories. The fact that we remember the Christmas Truce over a century later underscores how human stories of empathy and courage can persist despite official silence or suppression. It is a testament to the enduring power of human testimony and the importance of preserving accounts that highlight the softer, often overlooked dimensions of history. Interestingly, the truce also inspired future movements and commemorations. Modern peace organizations, veterans groups, and educational institutions have used the story as a teaching tool, emphasizing conflict resolution, empathy, and the moral choices individuals can make even under extreme circumstances. The narrative continues to serve as a reminder that peace is not merely the absence of war, but also the active presence of understanding, compassion, and shared humanity. In commemorations, carols are sung, letters are read, and symbolic gestures, such as laying wreaths or playing football, recreate the spirit of 1914, ensuring that its message endures. The most enduring lesson of the Christmas Truce lies in its illustration of the extraordinary within the ordinary. Amidst death, mud, and frozen despair, soldiers chose laughter over hatred, dialogue over hostility, and music over silence. This moment, fleeting yet profound, demonstrates that even in the most rigid and violent systems, human agency can carve out spaces of empathy and connection. The truce continues to remind us that the human heart, capable of kindness and creativity, can transcend boundaries imposed by ideology, nationality, or circumstance. In closing, the Christmas Truce of 1914 stands not only as a historical anomaly, but as a beacon of hope, illustrating the timeless possibility of peace. It is remembered not merely for the cessation of gunfire, but for the affirmation of humanity against the backdrop of mechanized warfare. The soldiers' courage to reach across enemy lines, share songs, gifts, and simple acts of kindness remains a testament to the enduring power of empathy.